Hi everyone, tonight we're going to begin a story that starts with a creaking garage door and a blast of cold Connecticut air, both of which, I promise, play a bigger part than they seem. You might think sleeping in a garage is something that happens to people down on their luck. But in my case, I was a 68-year-old retired CEO sleeping next to a rusted garden rake and a carton of old Christmas ornaments, all because I gave my daughter everything I had. So before you feel like crawling under 3 layers of fleece blankets and rage texting your ungrateful son-in-law, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are? Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The garage door creaked open like it had arthritis. Cold air rushed in, cutting straight through the old wool cardigan I hadn't taken off in 3 days. My fingers fumbled across the wall until the light clicked on overhead, a single bulb swaying slightly, making shadows of cardboard boxes dance around me. My bed was a fold-out cot, wedged between a plastic bin full of outdated tax files and a dented lawnmower we hadn't used since Thomas died. That was my life now. And the worst part, just 50 feet away in the glowing warmth of the house I built from the ground up, my daughter Jessica and her husband were hosting another dinner party. I heard laughter drift through the winter air, clinking glasses. Someone turning up jazz music like this was some Westport dinner affair. I was Eleanor Wilson, and this was my reward. Let me give you a little context, because things don't just go from white picket fence to garage overnight. Well, unless you're a 60-something widow who made the unforgivable mistake of trusting your only daughter with everything you had. I never planned to live with Jessica. After my husband Thomas passed from pancreatic cancer, I was doing just fine in the big old colonial we'd built together. Wilson Construction, that was our baby. While Thomas handled the hammer and hard hats, I was the spreadsheets and blueprints behind the scenes. I designed every inch of that house from the stair rail to the cozy little reading nook we built under the stairs for Jessica when she was 7. But grief does funny things. When Thomas died, I wanted nothing more than to keep his promise, look after our girl. And that I did. When Jessica brought home Andrew, her polished college sweetheart with the perfect teeth and a smile that looked like it had gone through PR training, I didn't say much. Thomas had liked him. That was enough at the time, but from the moment Andrew stepped into our lives, there was a shift. At first it was subtle, the little digs, the way he always had to fix something even when it wasn't broken. And of course his family had opinions, particularly his mother Patricia, who once referred to my house as quaint, which in Connecticut speak is just shy of calling it beneath her standards. Still, I let it slide. So when Andrew started talking about moving into the family home, said Jessica wanted to raise kids in the same house she grew up in, I fell for it. Hook, line, and emotional bait. I signed over the deed, handed it to Jessica with tears in my eyes and a hopeful heart. The deal was simple. I'd live in the guest suite, the one we'd built for my mother years ago. Comfortable, private. Still mine in a way. But slowly, they began chipping away at my presence, like termites in a floorboard. It started with the dishes. My good china moved to the highest shelf where I needed a step stool to reach it. Then the little comments, Mom maybe use the side entrance when Andrew has colleagues over. You know, just so it doesn't look cluttered. I wasn't clutter. I was the reason they had that damn house. But the real slap came one chilly Friday in November. I'd been visiting my sister in Rhode Island for the weekend. When I returned, Jessica met me in the driveway. Not inside, not even on the porch. She didn't look me in the eye. Andrew's parents are coming to stay for a month, she said. We're giving them the guest suite. And me, I asked already, feeling the frost seeping into my bones. The garage. It's temporary, Mum. We've insulated it. There's a heater. You'll be fine. I wasn't fine. The cot groaned every time I turned. My breath fogged the air even with the heater running full blast. I developed a cough that wouldn't leave. But what a woman of 68 learns, besides how to stretch a dollar and keep a secret, is how to endure. I didn't complain, not out loud, but I saw the writing on the drywall. Andrew was pushing me out, and Jessica was letting him. Maybe this is where I should have screamed, slammed doors, made a scene. But I didn't. Because what mother wants to believe her daughter doesn't care. Still, one thing Thomas taught me besides how to read a contract upside down was to always have a backup plan. And after another night of wheezing into my pillow, while the warmth from the main house lit up the yard like a Pottery Barn catalogue, I knew it was time. I picked up my phone, scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in years, George Thompson, my husband's old business partner. One of the few men who knew just how much Wilson Construction was really worth and how much I still had tucked away. My finger hovered over the screen. Was I really ready to admit what this had all become? I pressed call. It rang once, twice. And then, Eleanor Wilson, came his voice. Took you long enough. I leaned back against the cold metal wall of the garage and closed my eyes for a moment, the phone still warm in my palm. George had said those words like he'd been expecting this call for years. Maybe he had. Maybe he always knew Jessica wasn't as anchored as Thomas and I had once believed. Where do you want to start? He asked. From the moment I became a guest in my own house, I replied, my voice hoarse, partly from the cold, and partly from the shame I didn't want to admit I felt. There's something unsettling about watching your own home from the outside. I could see it now, glowing with light and laughter, like it belonged in a holiday commercial. The drapes Jessica picked out were drawn, just so framing the wide windows that looked into the kitchen I once ran like a 5-star operation. They'd repainted, pale grey, sleek, soulless. A few years ago, I would have called that house the crown jewel of my life. I had designed it from scratch with Thomas. We used to joke that it was our third child. We'd picked out every window pane, every doorknob. The wraparound porch was my dream. The kitchen island was his. And that reading nook under the stairs. That was built the week Jessica turned 7. She had asked for a treehouse. I gave her an indoor one, painted pale yellow, with a little shelf for her books and a sconce shaped like a flower. Now it was gone. Andrew had ripped it out in one of his modernization projects, said it disrupted the flow of the space. The flow. I guess that's how people like Andrew see home spaces to be edited, upgraded, optimized like their software. Not places with history, with spirit. George let me speak for a long time before he chimed in. Do you still have access to any of the old documents, property transfers, contracts? I have the originals, I said. Thomas kept hard copies of everything. Even after we sold the company, I kept the habit. You always were the smart one in that duo, he said with a chuckle. I smiled at that, even through the lump in my throat. Thomas used to say the same thing, usually while spilling coffee on one of my printed spreadsheets. You want me to come up there? George asked finally. Yes, I said. But quietly. I don't want Andrew knowing I've made this call. Not yet. The plan was simple. George would fly in from Florida, stay at a hotel in the next town, and we'd meet at the Green Street Cafe like two old friends catching up. No raised eyebrows, no drama, just a calm, calculated regroup. You know, like the old days when Thomas and I were still negotiating contracts with cold brew in hand. Back in the garage, I wrapped myself in 2 blankets and tried to sleep. The heater clicked loudly every few minutes, and the floor creaked when the wind pressed against the siding. But it wasn't the cold that kept me up. It was the ache, not in my bones, though those certainly had their complaints, but in my chest. Giving away that house had felt like love, like legacy. Jessica had looked at me with tears in her eyes when I signed the deed. I can't believe you'd do this for us, she'd whispered. I'd smiled and said, it's always been yours. And I had believed it. I truly had. Because back then, Jessica still felt like my daughter. The girl who wore light-up sneakers and left glitter glue on my office chair. Not this woman who asked me to use the side entrance when Andrew had clients over. Side note, by the way, Did you know that owls can rotate their heads 270 degrees, but still have terrible peripheral vision? Yeah, I learned that from a nature show in the garage one night. Funny how you notice useless facts when your life feels like it's unraveling. Anyway, the next morning, I woke to the sound of leaf blowers and the smell of cinnamon toast drifting from the main house. Jessica used to love cinnamon toast. I taught her how to make it with just the right ratio of butter to sugar, and we'd eat it while watching cartoons in our robes. Now she made it for Andrew's colleagues, I assumed, paired with mimosas and polite small talk. I shuffled to the bathroom corner of the garage, if you can call a sink and a toilet, behind a plastic divider a bathroom. Washed my face, changed into fresh clothes, brushed my teeth using bottled water. And then I sat at the edge of the cot and stared at the framed photo of Thomas I kept on the little shelf beside me. "You should have seen this coming," I whispered to him. "You always said Jessica was too trusting." He smiled at me from behind the glass, cradling baby Jessica in his arms like she was made of starlight. I missed him so much, it felt like a physical wound. At 10:30 sharp, my phone buzzed. "George landed. Meet you at Green Street, 11:15. I pulled on my coat, one of the few things that still felt like mine, and made my way down the icy sidewalk toward the cafe, leaving the glowing windows of my own home behind me. As I walked, I thought about the time Thomas and I had stayed up all night designing the back porch railing. We'd argued about baluster spacing. I wanted 6 inches. He said 4. We compromised at 5, and then he spent the next 10 years telling anyone who complimented the railing that it was all Ellie's design. Old age fact for today. Couples who argue but resolve things with compromise tend to have longer marriages. It's true. You can look it up. Anyway, George was already at the cafe when I arrived, sipping his coffee like he hadn't aged a day past 60. His hair had gone full white, but his eyes still held that same mix of charm and shrewdness that made Thomas trust him with half our company. He stood as I entered. "Eleanor Wilson," he said with a grin. "Still walking like you own the pavement." I sat down across from him. "Well, George, I might not own the pavement anymore, but I sure as hell remember how it was poured." George stirred a packet of raw sugar into his coffee with the same concentration he used to bring to our construction budget reviews. When he finally looked up, his expression was soft, but serious. "So, Eleanor," he said, "tell me when exactly you started letting people treat you like an antique instead of an asset." I snorted into my tea. "Bold of you to assume I let it happen." He raised an eyebrow. "You're living in a garage." Touché. We sat at that corner table like 2 retired spies trading intel. I gave him the full picture. The repainted walls, the disappearing reading nook, the kitchen rearranged so I couldn't reach the high shelves without asking for help. Every little adjustment that at the time I told myself was no big deal. The academic term for this, by the way, is boiling frog syndrome. You don't notice the water getting hot if it happens slowly. You just sit there until it's scalding. It wasn't one big betrayal. It was a series of small ones. Death by 1,000 polite suggestions. George listened quietly, nodding at all the right parts. But I could see his jaw clench when I told him about being moved to the garage. "That's not oversight, Ellie," he said. "That's deliberate erasure." I didn't respond right away. Outside, a woman walked past with a golden retriever in a little blue jacket. The dog looked happier than I felt. I thought if I gave Jessica everything I said softly, she'd remember who she was raised to be. "Maybe she still will," George said. "But right now, you need to remember who you were raised to be. The woman who built a company with her bare hands and a calculator. You taught me how to read risk charts, for crying out loud." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a folder. Thick, clean, marked in his perfect blocky handwriting, Horizon Holdings, Eleanor W. "When we sold Wilson Construction, we diversified. Put properties and investments into a separate entity, an LLC called Horizon Holdings. On paper, Horizon was a quiet little umbrella company. In reality, It was a vault of assets Thomas and I had kept tucked away for decades. George had helped set it up. Only he and I knew its full scope. He slid over a spreadsheet, tapping his finger on the totals column. Between the Vermont cabin, the real estate developments in Westchester, and the offshore accounts you're sitting on, just under $4.2 million. I stared at the number, and then laughed. Actually laughed. Loud enough that a woman at the next table glanced over with mild Connecticut disapproval. George the Femi whispered, "I'm worth millions. And I've been living in a garage with a space heater from Walmart." He grinned. "Welcome back, Ellie. There's an old saying. The best revenge is living well, but the second best living well while someone else still thinks you're helpless." That's when I knew we weren't just reacting anymore. We were strategizing. I wasn't going to storm the house or beg Jessica for dignity. That wouldn't work. Andrew needed to be handled like a contractor whose fudging numbers caught cornered and quietly dismantled. And that starts with watching. I returned to the garage that afternoon with fresh eyes. Every cough-inducing corner. Every spider web over a forgotten toolbox. This was my disguise. My camouflage. Because, let's be real, Andrew thought I was done. Just a tired widow who got in the way of dinner parties and corporate image building. He assumed I had nothing left. No resources. No allies. It was almost adorable. That evening, I stepped into the main house like a shadow. Jessica was in the kitchen, chopping something bright and trendy, maybe beets. She didn't notice me at first. "Mum," she said after a pause, not turning around. "We're having people over tonight. Andrew asked if you'd mind staying out back." Out back. Like I was the gardener or the raccoon that sometimes raided the trash cans. I smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Just came to grab my book." She seemed relieved. And that's when I realized I'd stopped being a person with a place in this house. I'd become a problem she didn't know how to solve. I grabbed my book from the side table and glanced at the hallway. A framed photo of Andrew and Jessica on their honeymoon had replaced the old one of Thomas, holding up the porch blueprint with a goofy smile. Later that night from the garage, I could hear them laughing with their guests. The windows glowed, the jazz played, and I counted the lights as they flickered in the cold. It reminded me of something Thomas used to say when contractors cut corners on foundation work. If you don't reinforce it properly, it'll look fine for a while. Until the first storm. Well, a storm was coming, and I, Eleanor Wilson, had just remembered where I stored the lightning. Oh, and quirky fact of the day, lobsters communicate by peeing out of their faces. Which honestly makes more sense to me now after dealing with Andrew. The first betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came wrapped in passive phrases and smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. It came with the word temporary. The night I found my belongings moved out of the guest suite and into the garage, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even knock on the door. I stood in the driveway in my weathered coat, holding a box labeled Mom's Stuff. Fragile. And watched Jessica pretend like this was all reasonable. "They're only staying for a few weeks," she'd said. "Andrew's parents. You know how they are. We didn't want to make them uncomfortable." I remembered the look Patricia Reynolds gave me at the wedding reception when she saw the napkins didn't have their family crest embroidered. That woman thought I was one wrong wine pairing away from collapsing the social order. But this was new. Jessica's voice had a practiced tone, like she'd rehearsed the whole speech in the mirror while straightening her hair. "You'll be fine out here," she added. "It's insulated." It wasn't. There was a space heater, a twin-sized cot, and the smell of motor oil clinging to every surface. The toilet in the tool room had a sticky handle, and the sink drained like it needed to be convinced. They hadn't asked. They'd decided. And that's when I started cataloguing. Not just the decisions, but the erasures. The renovations that quietly eliminated the physical memories of Thomas. The reading nook under the stairs gone. The hand-carved oak cabinets he spent weeks perfecting ripped out for something cleaner. The ceramic tiles in the guest bath that we'd picked out on our 30th anniversary trip to Italy replaced with bland grey slabs that looked like a corporate bathroom in a tech startup. Each change wasn't just aesthetic, it was personal. It was subtraction. When I asked Jessica about the cabinets, she smiled like a real estate agent explaining granite countertops. Oh, Mum, Andrew says they made the space feel dated. You know his clients expect a certain image. I blinked. His clients tour your bedroom. She flushed, just briefly. Well, we're hosting a housewarming, and people will want a full tour. It needs to look cohesive. Cohesive. Like I was the odd puzzle piece now. Like the woman who'd once designed this house from napkin sketches was now a stylistic mismatch. And still I said nothing. Because somewhere in my head I heard Thomas. Promise me you'll look after our girl. But here's the thing about promises. They don't mean you become someone's doormat. They mean you protect what matters. And if that means waking up and realizing your own daughter can hurt you, then so be it. One night, Martha and I sat in the park, drinking 2 hot tea from paper cups, watching toddlers fling sand like it was currency. You're too generous, she said flatly. You gave her everything and now you're playing by Andrew's rules. I gave her a head start, I replied, though it tasted bitter in my mouth. It's her inheritance. I just signed it over early. Martha shook her head. There's giving someone a gift, Ellie, and then there's handing them a sword and standing still. She wasn't wrong, and here's your old age wisdom moment. After a certain age, you stop expecting apologies. You start looking at behavior patterns like tea leaves, except instead of predicting your future, you're learning how you've been rewritten in someone else's story. Jessica had rewritten me as a minor character, and Andrew, he'd recast himself as the protagonist, the self-made man. Never mind that every square inch of their beautiful home was made possible by Thomas's calloused hands and my long nights balancing books and drafting budgets. So I started testing the waters. Small questions. I asked Jessica what she remembered about Dad's company. Her answer, he built houses right. And Steve Jobs just sold computers. I asked if she remembered the reading nook. Vaguely, she said. Didn't we paint it green? It was yellow. Buttercup yellow. She'd picked it out herself at 7 years old and insisted we add a lamp shaped like a daisy. I realized then that she hadn't just outgrown that house, she'd outgrown the version of herself that loved it. That night, as I folded a blanket over my legs in the garage and listened to the muffled sounds of laughter echoing through the walls, I picked up my notebook and made a list. Things they've replaced. Reading nook, guest bathroom tiles, oak cabinets, picture of Thomas by the fireplace, my role as a mother. That last one hit the hardest, because being a mother isn't just biology. It's time, it's memory, it's presence. And I had been slowly erased from the center of my daughter's orbit. Funny thing, I once read that hummingbirds remember every single flower they've visited. But apparently children can forget the woman who raised them just by repainting the living room. Later, when Jessica passed me in the hallway one afternoon, she said, "Oh, by the way, Andrew's planning on putting in a wine cellar under the stairs," where the nook was. The one space that held my favorite memory, reading Charlotte's Web to Jessica on rainy days, her head on my lap, the smell of grilled cheese wafting in from the kitchen. A wine cellar, of course. That was the night I took out the old photo albums. The ones Andrew had accidentally boxed away during the last remodel. I sat on the cold garage floor and flipped through pages, Thomas in his work boots beaming beside a half-built porch. Jessica in her prom dress, her arms awkwardly looped around me. Me standing in front of Wilson Construction's first office, holding a clipboard and looking 10 feet tall. And I remembered who I was, not a charity case, not a relic in Andrew's curated lifestyle. I was Eleanor Wilson, a builder, a mother. A woman who once sat across from a Harvard-trained lawyer and made him renegotiate a clause because his decimal point was misplaced. They could move my belongings, they could change the tiles, but they couldn't undo my past, and they sure as hell couldn't predict what I'd do next. The next morning, I made a decision. Not the sort you scribble in a journal with a cup of herbal tea nearby. No, this one was heavy. Final. The kind you feel settle into your bones. I was done waiting. Done giving Jessica and Andrew the benefit of the doubt. Done pretending the garage was fine. Done letting someone else's narrative erase the one Thomas and I had built brick by loving brick. So I picked up my phone again. I didn't hesitate this time. I tapped George's name and let it ring. Ellie? He answered instantly. I was wondering when you'd call again. I need your help, I said. It's time to execute the contingency plan. There was a pause, then a low, satisfied chuckle. Thomas always said you'd wait too long. Yeah, well, I was being polite. That's done now. We met again the next day, same cafe. I slid into the booth across from George, feeling, if I'm being honest, a little like I was auditioning for an espionage drama. All that was missing was the trench coat and coded menus. George looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug. You're wearing lipstick. That's how I know you mean business. I'm wearing it because the woman in the garage had chapped lips, I said. And this one doesn't. He reached under the table and pulled out a manila envelope, thick enough to give a banker heart palpitations. Everything's in here. Horizon Holdings is still rock solid. Property deeds, account statements. The LLC papers are clean. And Eleanor, you're still the sole managing member. I opened it right there. Neatly stacked were documents that proved I had more financial firepower than Andrew Reynolds could even imagine in his best golf club daydream. And the cabin, I asked. George nodded. Still in Vermont. Still beautiful. Still off the books. We keep the utilities low so no one thinks to look twice. I had a property manager check in last week. Everything's ready if you need to disappear for a bit. I let that sink in. The cabin wasn't just a vacation home. It was an exit route. Thomas and I had purchased it a decade ago under the Horizon umbrella right before his health started failing. He'd insisted on it. A smart woman always has a backup plan, he used to say, usually while hiding emergency chocolate in his desk drawer. Well, Thomas, I was using the plan now. And here's your old age wisdom for the day. Never tie all your ropes to one anchor, especially not people. The anchor might not hold when the storm comes. George lowered his voice. So, what's the real plan, Ellie? Just reclaim your finances, or go for something bigger. I'm not just trying to rescue myself, I said. Jessica's still under his spell. But if I show my hand too early, he'll twist it. He always does. Then we make him underestimate you. Already done. He thinks I can't afford dinner at Panera. George grinned. Perfect. It was a strange feeling, this calm, calculated kind of rage. The kind where you didn't throw plates or raise your voice. You just started pulling threads. Quietly. Patiently. The same way I once unraveled a multi-million-dollar construction deal by proving a contractor was using substandard cement mix. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. Back at the garage, I made myself a cup of instant coffee and stared at the corkboard above my makeshift desk, also known as the back of an old IKEA cabinet I dragged in from the shed. I pinned up a copy of the Horizon Holdings org chart, a photo of the Vermont cabin, a list of Jessica's recent charity events, because yes, I was now keeping tabs. And in the center, I taped a sticky note with just one word: leverage. Quirky fact of the day. The word leverage originated from the Latin levar, meaning to lift. I found that poetic. Because I wasn't just looking for revenge. I wanted to lift myself out of this garage, out of invisibility, and out of the story Andrew had written for me. I started planning. Slowly, deliberately. I needed to play the long game. If Andrew thought I was still clueless, I could access things he wouldn't notice. Conversations. Files left open on shared computers. Changes to the house that might hide something else. My job now was to observe and gather. That night, Jessica knocked on the garage door. She stood there in a cashmere sweater and expensive-looking boots, holding a tray with soup and crackers like she was visiting someone in hospice. I brought dinner, she said, hesitant. Thought you might be tired. I took the tray with a smile. Thank you, sweetheart. You're very thoughtful. And then I asked casually, how are things with Andrew's firm? Jessica blinked. What do you mean? Just wondering how business is. He always seems so preoccupied. She frowned. They've had some shake-ups. A few clients pulled out, but nothing serious. His father's still overseeing most of the VIP accounts. VIP. Yeah. They have some, long-term legacy clients, big investors. Andrew doesn't really talk about it. I filed it away. Another thread. When she left, I sat down and wrote the phrase VIP clients in bold across the center of my notebook. Then I drew a line through it and replaced it with something better targets. I didn't sleep much that night. Not out of fear, not even from the cold. Though let's be real, the garage floor would give a Viking hypothermia. No, I stayed up because for the first time in months, I wasn't lost. I had a map now, a compass, and a reason. It's funny how quickly your mind sharpens when it has direction. I lay on that cot, the cheap polyester blanket clinging to my socks with static, and mentally walked through the entire house room by room, trying to remember what Thomas and I had stored hidden or left behind. Old blueprints in the attic, maybe. Tax folders in the basement. Possibly. Evidence of fraud. Not likely. That would be somewhere else. And the next day, I knew where to begin. I put on my just a harmless old lady cardigan. You know the one, the beige thing with the elbow patches that screams, I bake snickerdoodles and believe in thank you notes, and I stepped into the main house like I belonged. Because I did. Jessica was out. Pilates or pottery class or whatever women in financial advisor marriages do on Thursday mornings. Andrew, however, was in his office, and that was exactly what I wanted. I moved quietly. Years of sneaking chocolate without Jessica noticing had made me practically invisible in that house. Andrew's home office used to be Thomas's study, a space filled with woodworking catalogues and mug rings on the desk. Now it looked like a set from a very forgettable Netflix series. Glass desk chrome accents, and not a single paper out of place. It even smelled smug like bergamot and entitlement. I didn't go in, not yet. Instead, I moved to the living room where Jessica kept her entertaining bookshelf. You know, the one filled with novels no one's actually read, but all have tasteful, neutral-toned covers. Tucked behind a decorative candle, I found something more interesting, the household laptop. It wasn't Andrew's business computer that would be encrypted and sealed tighter than his jaw when someone brings up taxes at dinner. But this one, Jessica's login, easy. And inside a few folders labeled household budget renovation plans and bingo photos and documents. I wasn't looking for spreadsheets. I was looking for footprints. You see, digital footprints are like glitter. Once someone sprinkles them, they're impossible to fully clean up. I opened a folder titled Tax Docs 2023, then Client Events, and then a subfolder labeled simply Reynolds VIP. Inside were 3 PDFs. One was a list of names, no context, just names. Some I recognized. A couple belonged to men who'd donated obscene amounts of money to the Maplewood Country Club. One had a building downtown named after him. The second document was a statement template. It outlined a report for clients showing monthly returns, each one boasting a neat, consistent 8.7%, which in the financial world is about as suspicious as a toddler who's suddenly too quiet. And the third document, it was a scanned memo, unsigned, undated, but unmistakably written by someone in charge. It included language like buffering returns for sensitive accounts and ensure discretion with elderly clients. I copied all 3 to a flash drive I'd hidden in the inside lining of my cardigan pocket. That lining had once hidden a sewing kit and now held the seeds of Andrew's collapse. Progress. Just as I was ejecting the flash drive, I heard the front door open. Jessica. I clicked everything closed, smoothed my sweater and strolled into the kitchen like I'd come in to grab a tea bag. Oh, hi, darling. Didn't hear you come in. Jessica jumped slightly. Mom, what are you doing in here? Looking for peppermint, I said, holding up a box. Thought it might help with my cough. She gave me a long look. You know you can ask me to bring you things. You don't have to sneak around. Of course not. I smiled. Just didn't want to bother you. You've been so busy lately. She looked tired, like someone who's been carrying someone else's secrets for too long. I wondered just for a second how much she knew. Really knew. Old age wisdom alert. People rarely lie all at once. It's more like layering paint, one coat at a time. By the time it's opaque, they've even forgotten what the wall looked like before. Later that afternoon, George and I met again, this time at his hotel room. He laid out the documents I had copied next to the Horizon Holdings papers, like he was preparing for trial. You were right, he said, reading through them. These returns are too perfect, too clean. No legit investment has this kind of consistency unless they're cooking the books or operating a magic wand. It gets worse, I said. I've been looking through old client names from when Thomas was alive. I think some of them ended up with Reynolds Financial. Clients who were, how do I say this, easily manipulated. Widows, elderly, people who wouldn't question the numbers. George looked up sharply. That's not just unethical. That's criminal. Then let's prove it. We decided to contact someone who might help us bridge the gap between suspicion and evidence. Her name was Olivia Chen. George had mentioned her before a former junior advisor at Reynolds Financial who'd left under mysterious circumstances. Top of her class at Wharton. Fired after asking too many questions. He'd reached out. She'd agreed to meet. If she's telling the truth, George said she could give us everything we need to crack Andrew wide open. And if she wasn't, well, I still had Horizon Holdings, a cabin in Vermont, and 4.2 million reasons not to sleep in a garage. Oh, and quirky fact of the day, flamingos aren't born pink, they turn pink because of what they eat. Shrimp, algae, stuff like that. Just a reminder, we're all shaped by what we consume. Information, relationships, lies. Andrew had been feeding Jessica half-truths for years. It was time to change her diet. I met Olivia Chen 2 days later at a quiet cafe tucked into the corner of a bookstore in downtown Stamford. The kind of place where no one asked questions, and the coffee came in mugs the size of soup bowls. She was younger than I expected, late 20s, maybe 30, with sharp eyes, and a blazer too expensive for someone between jobs. She stood as I approached and extended her hand. "Mrs. Wilson," she said. "It's an honor. I read about Wilson Construction in a case study once." I raised an eyebrow. "I hope we didn't bore you." She smiled. "You intimidated me." "Good." We sat down, and I got straight to the point. "George tells me you left Reynolds Financial suddenly." "I didn't leave," she corrected. "I was nudged out." I asked too many questions about how they were reporting certain portfolios. The moment I flagged inconsistencies, I was asked to take personal leave. The kind that doesn't end with a return date. "And what did you find?" She pulled out a folder. God bless people who still believe in paper trails, and laid out charts, memos, and flagged emails. "There's a pattern," she said. The VIP clients, especially the elderly ones, were getting fixed returns regardless of market performance. It's classic reverse rebalancing. Newer clients' investments were used to pad older clients' statements. Not technically Ponzi, but it's close. I scanned the files, the names, the dates. One name stopped me cold. Margaret Winters. Widowed. 84. Longtime friend of Thomas's sister. She used to send us Christmas cards with hand-drawn snowmen. She was a client, I asked. Olivia nodded. And one of the first to raise concerns. Her emails disappeared. My mouth went dry. I remembered Margaret. She was the kind of woman who mailed handwritten thank you notes for casseroles. She'd once knit Thomas a scarf. If Andrew had taken advantage of her, this wasn't just financial misconduct, it was personal. "I want to help," Olivia said quietly. "But you need to understand, Andrew Reynolds plays dirty. He's not stupid, and he's got friends in places you don't want to imagine." I smiled, slow and steady. "He's never met someone like me. Because here's the thing, Andrew saw me as harmless. An aging inconvenience. a cardigan-wrapped paperweight from a past generation. He didn't know I'd negotiated contracts in Dubai while 9 months pregnant. He didn't know I once filed an injunction against a building inspector for falsifying safety reports. He didn't know I had receipts, literally, boxes of them, still stored in the attic under a tarp labeled Xmas lights. "Olivia," I said, "would you be willing to testify if this goes to court?" She hesitated just for a breath. Then, "Yes. But I won't go in blind. I want protection, and I want a copy of every document we build." Done. We parted with a plan George would connect Olivia with our legal contacts, and I'd dig deeper on Margaret Winters and the other elderly clients buried in those reports. But when I returned to the house, things felt different. Andrew was home early. I stepped into the kitchen and found him leaning against the counter, sipping coffee, staring at nothing. "Jessica said you were out," he said, his tone too light. "I was at the bookstore." He nodded. "You've been going out more lately. I needed fresh air." He turned eyes sharp. "Just be careful what you breathe in, Eleanor. The world's full of things that look harmless but aren't." I stared back, not blinking. "Like mold in the walls." He smiled. "Exactly." We stood there, two polite enemies under a kitchen pendant light, and in that moment I realized he knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the flash drive or Olivia or the files tucked behind old cookie tins in the garage, but he knew I was waking up. And he didn't like it. Old age insight. You know you've rattled the right cage when the snake stops hissing and starts smiling. Later that evening, I pulled out the photo albums again. Not to reminisce, but to check something. Sure enough, tucked behind a 1987 Easter photo of Thomas in bunny ears, I found a small envelope labeled cabin, floor plan, storage panel. I opened it and nearly laughed out loud. A blueprint. Thomas had built a hidden storage panel under the kitchen floorboards in the Vermont cabin, fireproof, waterproof, and more importantly, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. I ran my fingers over the sketch, whispering to myself, "Of course you did." Thomas had prepared for everything, even this. Now I had a secure place to store the originals, the real statements, the client lists, and the growing mountain of evidence Olivia and I were collecting. There was still more to do, but the game had shifted. Andrew thought I was just suspicious. He had no idea I was building a case. And Jessica, I still didn't know where she truly stood, but something told me she was starting to wonder too. Quirky fact for today: sharks don't sleep the way we do. They keep swimming, constantly alert, always moving. Me, I was done sleeping. That weekend, I saw it happen, the first crack in Jessica's carefully curated world. It was Saturday morning, and the house smelled like someone had burned toast. I was organizing my papers in the garage, reviewing Olivia's notes, when I heard voices, Jessica and Andrew, just outside the laundry room. Not yelling, yet, but sharp enough to make me pause. "You didn't tell me we were shifting accounts around," Jessica was saying. "You said the Wyndham Trust was stable." "It is," Andrew snapped. "But you don't understand the timing involved in real estate-backed reallocations. It's not your area." "I handle the household accounts," she said, her voice rising. "If you're dipping into them for short-term liquidity—" "You want to be helpful, Jessica," he cut in. "Then stay in your lane." There was a long silence. Then footsteps. Fast. Hard. Jessica stormed past the garage without seeing me. Andrew's voice didn't follow. I waited a minute, then two, then slipped back into the main house like smoke under a door. I found her sitting at the dining table, staring at a glass of water like it might offer answers. "Rough morning?" I asked gently. She looked up, startled, and for a moment I saw the little girl who used to run to me after a scraped knee. "I don't know what's happening anymore," she whispered. "He's hiding things." I said nothing, just sat down across from her and waited. She kept talking. "I used to think we were partners, but now there are passwords I don't have. Accounts he used to show me that I'm suddenly not authorized to view. He tells me I'm paranoid when I ask questions." I leaned forward. "Jessica, do you trust him?" Her eyes welled up. "I used to. And now?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Instead, she looked at me and asked, Mom, did you ever feel like Dad was keeping something from you? I smiled, sad and warm. Only Christmas presents. That made her laugh, just a little. But it cracked the tension between us wide open. I didn't mention Olivia, not yet. But I started laying breadcrumbs. Do you remember Margaret Winters? I asked. She nodded. That sweet woman who used to send us popcorn tins. She was one of Andrew's clients. Jessica's brow furrowed. Really, really, I said softly. And she might not be the only one who's been misled. Jessica stared at the floor. Her fingers curled tightly around the glass. I stood up and let her sit with that. That evening, I went into the attic. It hadn't changed much since Thomas died, dusty cold, but familiar. Like an old friend who hadn't kept up with the times, but was glad to see you anyway. I rummaged through boxes labeled holiday tools, school projects, until I found what I was looking for. A black fireproof lockbox. Inside were decades of old files, contracts, receipts, photos, and hidden between two insurance policies, one of Thomas's final letters. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Jessica. I didn't read it. Not fully. But I saw the first line. If you're reading this, it means your mother had to fight for herself. I hope you listened. I closed the box slowly. Thomas had known. He hadn't just prepared financially, he'd prepared emotionally. He'd anticipated that our daughter might one day need to choose between comfort and conscience. I would wait to give her the letter. Not now, but soon. Back in the garage, I took out my corkboard and updated the center card leverage. Transition. Because this was no longer just about exposing Andrew. It was about reclaiming Jessica. Not as the child I remembered, but as a woman who had lost herself and might be ready to return. The next day, George called with an update. Olivia's agreed to a full deposition, he said. We'll need a legal team in place. I've got a contact retired SEC investigator named Brenda Hale. She's interested. Good, I said, because we're not just building a case anymore. We're building a net. And Andrew, he was still smiling at dinner parties, still adjusting cufflinks like they were medals of honor, still talking about market volatility like it was weather he could control. He had no idea what was coming. Oh, and quirky fact for the day, butterflies can remember things from when they were caterpillars. Scientists proved it. Memories that survive metamorphosis. I like that, because I'm not who I used to be, but I remember who I was, and I remember everything he took. The morning the lawyer arrived, I made muffins, blueberry, with a little lemon zest. The recipe was from a church cookbook I helped compile the year Jessica started middle school. I don't know why I made them. Maybe because I needed the kitchen to feel like mine again. Or maybe because sometimes even war needs warmth in the margins. Brenda Hale was not what I expected. She showed up in hiking boots and a tailored blazer, her grey hair pinned in a bun that looked like it had survived courtroom battles and wilderness treks alike. She had the kind of voice that made people stand up straighter, and eyes that had definitely seen the inside of more than one financial crime scene. Mrs. Wilson, she said, as I welcomed her into the cabin. You don't look like most of my clients. I'm not, I replied. Most of your clients probably didn't bake muffins before attempting to expose a fraud ring. She smiled. No, they usually ask if I brought a bodyguard. We sat at the kitchen table, me, Brenda, George, and Olivia, and laid everything out like a war room briefing. Dates, statements, testimonies, timelines, cross-referenced client names, and then Brenda asked the question I'd been waiting for. Are you prepared for what happens if this goes public? George shifted. Olivia looked down, but I didn't flinch. Yes, I said, because this isn't just about me anymore. Brenda nodded, satisfied. Then we need to move quickly. If this reaches the wrong ears, Andrew may try to bury the paper trail or discredit you entirely. I leaned forward. Let him try. He's been underestimating me from day one. That's his biggest weakness. Olivia chimed in. We can start with regulatory inquiries, quiet strategic pressure. Once we have enough corroboration, we bring in the authorities. Agreed, Brenda said, but we'll need someone inside. Silence fell. And then I said it. I think that might be Jessica. George looked surprised. Are you sure? No, I admitted. But I think she's on the edge. I just don't know which way she'll fall. That night, back in the garage, I found Jessica sitting on the cot. She didn't look at me when I walked in, just stared at the corner where the boxes were stacked. I used to love this garage, she said softly. When I was 10, Dad let me help him rebuild the shelving. I wore his gloves. They were way too big. I sat beside her slowly. I remember that I said, "You insisted on using the level even though everything came out slightly crooked." She smiled a little. Then, "Did you know Andrew opened a private account in his name using one of the joint trusts?" I turned to her, heart pounding. "How long have you known?" "I found a transfer receipt last week. When I confronted him, he told me I was too emotional to understand asset management." Her voice shook. I've been trying to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. But, Mom, it's not. "No," I said gently, "it's not." She looked at me, then eyes wide, vulnerable. "What do I do?" I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter. Thomas's letter. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. Read in silence. Tears ran down her face long before she reached the end. I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know how much of this you carried, how much I let him." I placed a hand on hers. "You can still make this right." She nodded. And just like that, I had my inside woman. Over the next week, we prepared her. Jessica quietly downloaded files from Andrew's personal drives, emails, account logs, private memos to his father referencing client smoothing and portfolio optics. She forwarded them to Brenda, encrypted and time-stamped. Andrew noticed nothing. Or if he did, he underestimated the source. Because why would his wife, the one he coached into docility, ever stand up? Quirky fact of the day. The female octopus can shut down her own body, stop eating, and still defend her eggs until they hatch. Her last act is protection, even if it kills her. Jessica wasn't dying, but she was done being silent. And me, I was finally reclaiming my voice, one document at a time. I never imagined my daughter would help me plan the downfall of her husband over tea and leftover muffins. But here we were. Jessica sat across from me at the cabin, a legal pad in her lap, her handwriting the same loopy script she'd used in middle school, except now, instead of doodling flowers in the margins, she was outlining a timeline of financial abuse. This one, she said, tapping a date, was when he transferred money from the Sanderson Trust. And this was the day I caught him deleting emails. She didn't cry anymore. That part had passed. What I saw now was something steadier. A quiet, simmering clarity. Like she was waking up from a long sleep and discovering the house was on fire, and instead of running, she was grabbing the extinguisher. George arrived later that day with Olivia in tow and a portable scanner. They set up shop on the dining table, scanning every document Jessica brought. The evidence was overwhelming, now layered transactions, falsified statements, internal memos hinting at strategic inflations. "I think we've got enough," Olivia said. "If we present this to the right regulatory authority, Reynolds Financial will be under investigation within 72 hours. Brenda Hale confirmed it. "We'll file with the SEC first," she said, quietly. "They'll open a private inquiry. But once it goes public," Jessica finished the sentence for her, "he'll know it was me." And yes, she was scared. I could see it in the way she gripped her teacup. But she didn't back down. I'd rather live in truth than die in his shadow. That night, I sat by the fireplace and finally exhaled. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt restored. Like the bones of a burned house finally being rebuilt. And yet I couldn't help but feel the ache of it too. This wasn't the ending I wanted for Jessica's marriage. When she walked down that aisle, I'd believed she was heading into something warm, something lasting. But that belief, like the house Andrew remodeled to erase me, had been a well-decorated illusion. I went to the garage the next morning, not to live in it, but to say goodbye to it. I stood there for a long time, looking at the cot, the cracked mirror. the box where I'd once kept all my toiletries, like I was a guest in someone else's life. And then I gathered it all: the heater, the threadbare blankets, even the dusty jar where I kept quarters for laundry. I packed them into the car and drove to the dump. One by one, I tossed each item into the bin, letting them go. Not just the things, but the shame, the self-doubt, the silence. When I got back, Jessica was on the porch waiting for me. She didn't say anything, she just hugged me. And that hug, long full reel, felt like a ribbon finally being tied around an old wound. The SEC moved fast. Within 2 days of our submission, investigators reached out to Olivia for confirmation. Within 5, Brenda received notice that a formal inquiry had opened. And on the 6th day, Andrew confronted Jessica. I wasn't there, but she told me every word. He came into the bedroom holding his phone, his face pale, his voice tight. "You did this," he said. Jessica didn't deny it. "All this time," he whispered, "you've been undermining me." "No," she replied. "I've been saving people from you." He left that night, packed a bag, slammed a door, tried to control the damage. But it was too late. By the end of the week, Reynolds Financial was under suspension. Olivia's testimony made national news. Elderly clients came forward. One by one, the puzzle pieces fell into place. And me, I moved back into the house. Not because I had to, because I chose to. We tore up the wine cellar project, repainted the guest suite. And in the space under the stairs, we built something new. Not a reading nook, a memory shelf. We placed a framed photo of Thomas there, holding Jessica when she was small, a ceramic mug with his initials, a tiny wooden house he'd carved for our anniversary, and a card, one that simply read, "This house remembers." Quirky fact of the day: in some trees, scars from lightning strikes never fully disappear. But they don't kill the tree. They mark it. And the tree keeps growing. I am that tree, scarred, struck, but standing. And from here on out, I grow exactly where I decide. The first news article came out on a Tuesday. Reynolds Financial under federal investigation. Allegations of elder fraud, falsified statements. It was front page on the Stamford Gazette's second page in the Hartford Review, and within 24 hours trending on Twitter. Andrew's face was right there beside the headline, confident, smug, captured at a charity gala last fall, back when he still believed reputation was a kind of armor. By Wednesday, the phones were ringing non-stop. Journalists, lawyers, ex-clients. The family group chat, long dormant, was suddenly alive with questions. And Jessica, she stood tall. She answered calls from confused relatives, dodged the press waiting outside the driveway, and refused to flinch when her in-laws left a voicemail calling her a traitor. Meanwhile, George, Brenda, Olivia, and I kept moving. Our strategy had always been airtight, gather, corroborate, then drop the hammer. Now it was time for the final phase, consolidating the testimonies from affected clients and building a formal civil suit. And that meant reaching out to the ones Andrew had hoped would stay silent. Like Margaret Winters. Jessica made the call. "Mrs. Winters," she said, voice soft, careful. "It's Jessica Wilson Reynolds. I don't know if you remember me." "Oh, of course I do, dear," came the warm reply. "You used to bring me tulips in the spring. Your mother raised you right." Jessica swallowed. "That's what I'm trying to live up to again." They talked for nearly an hour. When she hung up, Jessica was crying. She said she'd almost given up, she whispered. Thought no one would believe her. That maybe she'd just misremembered. "She didn't," I said, "and she won't be alone anymore." The next few days were a whirlwind of coordination. Statements were notarized. Olivia compiled internal emails. Brenda drafted the official civil complaint. Meanwhile, Andrew tried to control the bleeding. He hired a PR firm, put out a vague statement about compliance reviews and discrepancies being addressed. But the damage was done. You can't uncrack an egg. And Andrew's image, flawless, curated, high-powered, was now soaked in suspicion. Jessica stayed strong. She met with Brenda in person, handed over financial records, even recorded a sworn statement. I didn't see it at first, she admitted, her voice trembling. But once I did, I couldn't pretend anymore. I had to do something. Brenda nodded, professional and calm. You just helped save a lot of people. That night we sat on the porch, Jessica beside me, a blanket wrapped around our legs, the sky wide and clear above the Vermont trees. Do you think I'm a coward? She asked. I looked at her. Really looked. No, I think you're brave. Cowards stay silent. You spoke up. She leaned into me, rested her head on my shoulder like she hadn't done in years, and for the first time since Thomas died, I felt peace. Not the passive kind, the earned kind. Because here's the thing they don't tell you. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a gavel or a grand speech. Sometimes it comes in the quiet moments, when you know you were right to stand, even if you stood alone for a while. Quirky fact of the day: penguins propose by presenting a perfect pebble. They search until they find one that's smooth and unbroken, then offer it to their mate. I like that, because it means love. Real love is about effort, intention, quiet gestures that say, I see you, I choose you. Jessica chose me, and now I would help her rebuild, together, pebble by pebble. The day the civil suit was filed, it rained in Connecticut. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of rain, just a steady, grey drizzle, the kind that blurred windows and made everything feel quieter than it really was. But behind that quiet movement, Olivia texted at 6:43 a.m. filed. The court docket's public by noon. George followed. 2 minutes later, Andrew's lawyer just called me. He knows. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the front window, and waited not for retaliation, but for the truth to finally echo louder than the lies. Jessica spent the morning in her old bedroom. She didn't speak much. But when she emerged just before lunch, she was wearing one of Thomas's old flannel shirts, rolled at the sleeves, worn soft from time. A quiet act of war, I suppose. Around 11:15 the doorbell rang. Andrew. He looked like someone who hadn't slept. No blazer, no cufflinks. Just a sweatshirt and eyes rimmed red. Eleanor, he said. Andrew, I replied. Jessica's in the living room. I'll give you two a moment. But I didn't go far. I stood in the hallway just out of view and listened, not because I was nosy, but because I needed to hear it. I trusted you, Jessica said. Her voice was calm. That was more dangerous than yelling. I made mistakes. No, you made choices. Repeatedly. You looked at people at me and you chose your image, your power, your money. You're throwing away our life. She cut him off. No, I'm saving mine. And then, like it was nothing at all, she said, you need to leave. There was silence. Then the sound of a zipper, a bag, the front door closing. That was it. No apology, no bargaining, just consequences. By that afternoon, news of the suit had hit national outlets. The SEC filed formal charges. 3 of Andrew's biggest clients pulled out. The firm froze all trading activity. A judge issued a temporary financial restraining order. And me, I returned to the garage one last time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to stand in the place where it all began. The place of my undoing. And now my rising. I took one last look at the cot, the heater, the cracked mirror. Then I turned out the light. As I walked back to the house, Jessica met me at the door. She held something in her hand. A photograph. It was old me and Thomas, standing in front of the original Wilson construction office. He had his arm around my shoulder, and I was holding the blueprint of the house that Jessica now lived in. He believed in you, she said. I looked at her. So do you. She nodded. Then I'd like to put this in the living room. We framed it that night. Hung it above the fireplace where Andrew's Art Deco monstrosity used to sit. And then together we began to build again. We opened old cookbooks, rearranged furniture, turned the garage into a creative space, sketches, sewing, writing, a room for becoming, not hiding. I started writing my story, not for revenge, for remembrance. Because memory, when wielded honestly, is power. And here's your quirky fact of the day. Japanese kintsugi is the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. They don't try to hide the cracks. They make them part of the story. I've got cracks. So does Jessica. But now we shimmer. There's a certain stillness that comes after a storm. Not silence exactly, but the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own breath again. That's what our house felt like in the days following Andrew's departure and the lawsuit going public. Jessica walked differently now, lighter somehow. She started putting her hair up the way she used to in college with a pen instead of a brush. She went to the market by herself. She laughed, unguarded, when I accidentally burned the toast. She cried too, but not from weakness, from release. One evening I found her sitting in the guest room, the same one that had once been mine before I was exiled to the garage. The windows were open. A breeze carried in the smell of cut grass and faint jasmine. She was organizing papers into neat piles. "What's all this?" I asked. She looked up, smiling. "I'm rebuilding." She was separating accounts, closing credit cards, untangling herself from Andrew's financial web. With Brenda and George's help, she was establishing full control of what was legally hers, including the shares I'd quietly reassigned to her after we launched the suit. "I've been so asleep," she said softly. "And I think you always knew I'd have to wake up on my own." I nodded. "You woke up when it mattered." That weekend, we took a trip to the cabin in Vermont. Just the two of us. We brought muffins, old photo albums, and a box of paints that hadn't seen the light of day since Jessica was 17. The trees had begun to turn amber and crimson flecks of gold, catching in the sunlight like confetti from the universe itself. We spent hours painting the deck, cleaning out the garden, laughing over memories that had once felt too far away. Jessica stood at the edge of the lake one morning, a mug of coffee in her hands, her reflection rippling in the water. "I don't know what I want to do next," she said. "But for the first time in years, I want to do something for me." "Good," I said. "Start wherever you are. That's always the right place." Later that afternoon, we took a walk through the woods, the same trail Thomas and I used to hike when we first bought the property. Jessica stopped, suddenly crouched near a moss-covered tree, and brushed aside a patch of leaves. "A small carving, T+E inside a heart. You did this?" she asked. I smiled. He did. I told him it was cheesy. He said it was necessary. She traced the letters with her fingers. "I think I get it now." We didn't speak much after that. We didn't have to. Back at the cabin, I opened my notebook. The same one I'd started months ago when I was living in the garage making lists just to stay sane. But this time, instead of cataloguing losses, I wrote something new. What we've rebuilt, trust, boundaries, a future, us. I don't know what will happen next in the courts. Maybe Andrew takes a deal. Maybe he goes to trial. Maybe he spins another narrative. But what matters is this his version of our story no longer owns us. We've reclaimed the chapters, and we're writing our own ending now. Quirky fact of the day. Starfish can regrow lost limbs. In some cases, they can even regenerate their entire body from just a single arm. We're a little like that too. Even when we're broken, we can come back. Not the same, but whole in a different way. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in a courtroom. Not as a defendant, not as a spectator, but as a witness. I wore a simple navy blouse, soft grey slacks, and a string of pearls Thomas gave me on our 25th anniversary. Something about that day felt sacred. Like I was walking into the final act of a long play I never auditioned for, but had somehow mastered anyway. The court was quiet, except for the gentle clack of shoes on the floor, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional cough. Andrew sat across the room, looking smaller than I remembered. Not physically, his frame was the same, but he lacked the arrogance that used to cling to him like expensive cologne. His hair wasn't as perfect. His suit wasn't as tailored. And the way he looked at Jessica Hollow, she didn't return the glance. Brenda stood calm and clear. "We'd like to call Eleanor Wilson to the stand." I walked slowly but deliberately. My steps didn't falter. I placed my hand on the Bible and took the oath. And then I told my story. How I gave everything to my daughter and her husband after my own husband died. How I was promised care and dignity, and instead was exiled to a garage 50 feet from the house I built. How I discovered financial inconsistencies. How I reached out to a former associate. How I uncovered client abuse. How I met Olivia. How Jessica, my daughter, his wife, chose truth over comfort. I spoke of Margaret Winters, of other elderly clients manipulated into silence, of trust broken and rebuilt. The courtroom didn't erupt. This wasn't a movie. But when I stepped down, I felt taller. Later, Olivia testified. So did two other former employees. Jessica read a written statement. Her voice was steady, even as her hands trembled slightly at the podium. And Andrew? He didn't testify. His lawyer requested a recess before they could call him. Word came later that week. Andrew had agreed to settle civil restitution, permanent revocation of his financial license, and public admission of misconduct. No jail time, but his reputation. Gone, along with most of his assets. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was enough. That evening, we had dinner at the cabin. Just me, Jessica, George, Brenda, and Olivia. We cooked pasta, opened wine, told stories. Jessica stood up mid-meal and raised her glass. To my mother, she said, who taught me how to build again. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because sometimes that's all you can do when everything feels full again. After everyone left, I stepped outside. The stars were out, bright, unapologetic. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like the sky. Quirky fact of the day, the moon has no light of its own. It only shines because it reflects the sun. Sometimes we find our light again by remembering what we reflect. Love, strength, memory. And me, I've always had the light. I just forgot where to aim it. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in a courtroom. Not as a defendant, not as a spectator, but as a witness. I wore a simple navy blouse, soft grey slacks, and a string of pearls Thomas gave me on our 25th anniversary. Something about that day felt sacred. Like I was walking into the final act of a long play I never auditioned for, but had somehow mastered anyway. The court was quiet, except for the gentle clack of shoes on the floor, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional cough. Andrew sat across the room, looking smaller than I remembered. Not physically, his frame was the same, but he lacked the arrogance that used to cling to him like expensive cologne. His hair wasn't as perfect. His suit wasn't as tailored. And the way he looked at Jessica Hollow, she didn't return the glance. Brenda stood calm and clear. We'd like to call Eleanor Wilson to the stand. I walked slowly but deliberately. My steps didn't falter. I placed my hand on the Bible and took the oath. And then I told my story, how I gave everything to my daughter and her husband after my own husband died, how I was promised care and dignity and instead was exiled to a garage 50 feet from the house I built, how I discovered financial inconsistencies, how I reached out to a former associate, how I uncovered client abuse, how I met Olivia, how Jessica, my daughter, his wife, chose truth over comfort. I spoke of Margaret Winters, of other elderly clients manipulated into silence, of trust broken and rebuilt. The courtroom didn't erupt. This wasn't a movie. But when I stepped down, I felt taller. Later, Olivia testified. So did two other former employees. Jessica read a written statement. Her voice was steady, even as her hands trembled slightly at the podium. And Andrew, he didn't testify. His lawyer requested a recess before they could call him. Word came later that week. Andrew had agreed to settle civil restitution, permanent revocation of his financial license, and public admission of misconduct. No jail time, but his reputation. Gone. Along with most of his assets. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was enough. That evening, we had dinner at the cabin. Just me, Jessica, George, Brenda, and Olivia. We cooked pasta, opened wine, told stories. Jessica stood up mid-meal and raised her glass. To my mother, she said, who taught me how to build again. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because sometimes that's all you can do when everything feels full again. After everyone left, I stepped outside. The stars were out, bright, unapologetic. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like the sky. Quirky fact of the day, the moon has no light of its own. It only shines because it reflects the sun. Sometimes we find our light again by remembering what we reflect. Love, strength, memory. And me, I've always had the light. I just forgot where to aim it. It's strange, isn't it, how endings rarely announce themselves? There's no neon sign flashing closure this way. No soundtrack swells. Just quiet moments where you notice that something has shifted and you're no longer surviving. You're living. That's how it felt one morning, almost a year after I moved out of the garage. I was standing in the kitchen, our kitchen again, pouring coffee into the mug Thomas once used every single morning. The house was peaceful. No more tension humming beneath the walls. No locked drawers or filtered silences. Just Jessica humming softly as she watered the plants. "Do you want to go into town later?" she asked. "The community center's doing a storytelling night. Open mic." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to get on stage?" "Not to perform," she laughed. "To listen. Though, you could read something. From your notebook." I smiled. "Maybe. Because that notebook, the one that once held timelines, suspicions, contingency plans, was now filled with memories, anecdotes, lessons, even recipes. It had become a record, not of what had gone wrong, but of what we'd reclaimed. The court case was long over. Andrew had disappeared into quiet disgrace. His name no longer opened doors. It barely triggered whispers. Olivia launched her own ethical finance firm. George went back into partial retirement with a gleam in his eye that told me he'd been waiting years for a fight like this. Brenda started consulting again, but made sure to stop by for tea once a month. And Jessica, she found herself again. She enrolled in a community business course, took up pottery, started volunteering at a legal aid nonprofit for women navigating financial abuse. Her laugh came easier now. So did her boundaries. One day, while cleaning out the attic, she found an old video of Thomas teaching her how to ride a bike. She watched it 3 times in a row. Then she looked at me and said, "I remember now. He always let go a second before I thought I was ready." That's how I learned. I started writing in earnest. Stories, reflections, and a collection of essays about late-life rebirth I titled After the Garage. I submitted a few to a local magazine. One of them was published last month. They asked for a photo to go with it, so Jessica took one of me in the garden, wearing my old denim jacket, a cup of tea in one hand, and dirt under my nails. The caption read, "Eleanor Wilson, 69. Proof that you're never too old to rebuild the damn house." Funny, isn't it? The very thing meant to make me small, the exile, the betrayal, the cold floor of that garage became the spark that lit everything. Not just revenge, but return. Not just justice, but becoming. Last week, I took a solo trip to the Vermont cabin. It was late fall. The trees were starting to sleep, their leaves scattered like secrets no longer worth keeping. I stood at the edge of the lake and dropped a pebble into the water, watched the ripples fade, and whispered to the sky, "We're okay now, Thomas." Because we are. Jessica and I, the house, me. And here's one last quirky fact for the road. There's a species of tree in Africa that, when injured, sends out chemical signals to warn nearby trees. They begin producing bitter compounds to protect themselves even before they're attacked. It's called communal resilience. And I think that's what this story really was. A mother sending a signal, a daughter learning to listen, and a house that brick by brick remembered how to stand. So if you're listening to this, wherever you are, whatever exile you've endured, whatever garage you've found yourself trapped in, please know you are not forgotten. You are not done. You can always start again, even at 68, even after everything. Especially then,